He was a Navy SEAL once, trained to survive anything but guilt. Now he's just a repairman in a quiet coastal town, living with his old dog in the silence of everything he's lost. Then he bought a mansion no one wanted, for $100. And the first night, his dog started barking at the basement wall. Behind that wall, he found a sealed drum, a burned letter, and a photograph of his wife, standing beside the man who betrayed them both. Was her death an accident, or the cover-up of something that still poisons this town? Would he walk away and stay free, or dig until the truth destroys the only peace he's ever known? And if he does, will love, loyalty, or something greater save what's left of him? Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story touches your heart, subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and second chances. The rain had a strange patience that night, falling in fine, endless threads over the coast of Harbor Point. The old Merino estate loomed at the end of a cracked driveway, its windows blind with dust, its iron gates yawning open like a jaw that had forgotten how to close. Jack Bennett sat behind the wheel of his rusted pickup, staring at the silhouette of his new home. He was 41, broad-shouldered but lean, his face marked by the quiet erosion of sleepless years. A faint scar crossed his right temple, the last memory of the explosion that had taken his wife and half of his hearing in one ear. To the world, he was just another ex-Navy SEAL fallen out of use. To himself, he was a man still waiting for the war to end. Beside him, Ranger let out a low whine. The German Shepherd was 6 years old, with a thick brown and black coat and an old service tag still dangling from his collar. One ear bent slightly forward, the one that hadn't healed right since Syria. Ranger had been more than a dog. He was a partner, a lifeline. In the dark, his amber eyes reflected the faint interior light of the truck, watchful and loyal. Jack reached over, scratched behind his ear, and muttered, "We've seen worse, huh, buddy?" The dog thumped his tail once, as if agreeing, and Jack stepped out into the rain. The air smelled of sea salt and rust. The Merino house towered above him, 4 stories of stone and ivy, the kind of place that might have been beautiful once, but now carried only the dignity of decay. Eli Ward had called it a project, a second chance for Jack to rebuild something solid. Eli had said the city was desperate to get rid of it, that all Jack had to pay was the back taxes, $100, a price too small to make sense. But Eli's voice had sounded almost too eager on the phone, the way someone might sound when giving away a cursed heirloom. Jack pushed the thought aside. He needed somewhere quiet, somewhere to drown the ghosts that followed him home from the desert. Inside, the house was cold and hollow. His boots echoed through the grand foyer, where a cracked chandelier swayed gently in the draft. Ranger padded beside him, nose low to the ground, sniffing the air like a soldier clearing a room. Dust hung thick in the beam of Jack's flashlight. Furniture still sat beneath white sheets, their outlines like sleeping figures. On the mantel, he found a tarnished photo frame turned face down. When he lifted it, the glass was broken, and behind the cracks was a faded portrait of a man and woman from another century, smiling as if they hadn't known how stories like theirs ended. Jack set it back carefully, feeling an ache he couldn't name. He explored the first floor in silence, his steps deliberate. Every creak of the old floorboards reminded him of the abandoned safe houses he'd swept through overseas, the tension, the waiting. But here, the enemy wasn't armed men hiding behind doors. It was time itself. Ranger suddenly froze, ears perked, his gaze fixed down the long corridor leading toward the library. The lights flickered, and for a moment Jack thought he heard a soft rustle, like fabric brushing the wall. "Easy," he whispered, resting a hand on Ranger's back. The dog growled once, then went still. Jack shone the flashlight ahead. Nothing. Only an old mirror hanging crooked on the wall, its surface dull with grime. For half a heartbeat, he thought he saw movement behind his reflection, a shape, white and slender, stepping back into the dark. He shook it off. Fatigue. Memories. The rain was drumming harder now, rattling the window panes. He returned to the kitchen, unpacked his single duffel, and laid out a thin blanket on the couch. Ranger circled twice before lying down near the fireplace, eyes still open. Jack poured himself a glass of cheap bourbon from his bag, leaned back, and stared at the ceiling where water stains mapped constellations he didn't know. He thought about Anna, her laugh, her hands, the day she'd volunteered for that last mission, the one he hadn't stopped her from taking. The last message she'd sent him was a single line: "Don't wait for me at the shore." The power flickered, the house exhaling as if it had lungs. Ranger barked once, sharp, warning. Jack rose, heart thudding, and followed the dog into the hallway. The air had changed, colder, heavy with the scent of rain-soaked earth. Lightning cracked outside, lighting up the corridor in a white flash. For an instant, at the far end near the mirror, stood a figure, a woman with wet hair clinging to her face, eyes wide and filled with sorrow. Anna. She didn't speak. She only shook her head slowly, as if begging him not to step closer. The next thunderclap shattered the silence, and when darkness returned, she was gone. Only a set of wet footprints led toward the front door and faded halfway across the marble floor. Jack stood there, breathing hard, the glass of bourbon trembling in his hand. Ranger pressed against his leg, tail low, eyes fixed on the place where she'd stood. Outside, the rain poured without pause, swallowing the sound of the sea. Jack whispered almost to himself, "I must be losing it." But deep down, he knew what he'd seen wasn't madness. It was memory trying to speak. Somewhere beneath the ruin and rain, the past had begun to stir again. The morning broke gray and cold, the kind of light that made everything in the Marino house look half-remembered. The storm had passed, but the air still carried the tang of rain and iron. Jack woke stiff on the couch, the sound of Ranger's claws tapping softly against the marble floor. The German shepherd was pacing near the hallway, ears tilted, eyes fixed on the far wall as if something beneath the plaster whispered to him. Jack rubbed his temples, feeling the dull ache that had followed him since the war, an echo of concussions and sleepless years. He stood, poured cold coffee into a chipped mug, and watched the dog paw at a section of the wall where the paint looked fresher than the rest. "What's got you worked up, partner?" he muttered. Ranger barked once, sharp and insistent. The house was too quiet afterward, as though it was listening. The wall in question was smooth, the color slightly off. Jack touched it, running his palm over the surface. The cement felt newer, cooler. Whoever had patched it hadn't done so long ago. He fetched a hammer from his duffel and began tapping lightly along the baseboards, listening for a hollow sound. It came after the third knock, an empty thud beneath the plaster. Ranger crouched, tail low, growling softly. Jack hesitated, his breath fogging faintly in the chill. The same instinct that had saved him 100 times overseas told him this wasn't just a wall. He chipped away the plaster until a small hole appeared, enough to reach inside. Dust poured out, dry and bitter. His fingers touched metal, a small rusted box wedged between the studs. He pulled it free, coughing as the air filled with debris. The box was military issue, the kind used to store ammunition. Jack brushed the grime away, revealing faded stenciling. Property of U.S. Navy, restricted. A chill worked its way down his spine. He popped the latch, and inside lay a handful of corroded .45 rounds, a military badge half bent, and a torn scrap of fabric, the corner of a uniform sleeve, stamped with the insignia of SEAL Team 7. His team, the same unit that had been disbanded after the Syria incident, the same mission that had killed Anna. Jack stared at it for a long time, the taste of metal thick in his throat. "What the hell is this doing here?" he whispered. Ranger whined and nudged the box with his nose, then turned toward the staircase, hackles bristling. Something creaked above them, slow, deliberate, as though a footstep pressed against the old boards. Jack's muscles tensed. He slipped the badge into his pocket and quietly moved toward the sound. It was Eli Ward who appeared in the doorway not long after. He had the build of a man who once trained hard and then stopped trying. Broad shoulders softened by the years, a short beard flecked with gray. His clothes were clean but carelessly buttoned, as if he'd dressed while thinking of something else. "You look like hell," Eli said, stepping in with that half-smile he'd always used when hiding a truth. Jack forced a grin. "And you look like someone who sleeps too well." The two men clasped hands briefly, and Jack noticed Eli's grip still carried the same strength as it had years ago, though now there was a hesitation beneath it. "Just checking in," Eli said. "Figured you might need some help getting settled. How's the palace treating you?" His voice echoed faintly through the hall, swallowed by the empty rooms. Jack gestured toward the wall where the box had been. "You ever hear anything about this place being connected to the military?" Eli frowned, his blue eyes narrowing. "Military? Nah. Rumor was old man Marino ran guns for the mob back in the day. Maybe he got his hands on some army junk. You know how stories go." He gave a small, dry laugh, the kind that never reached his eyes. Jack studied him in silence. Eli had been his teammate once, the radio operator, sharp and steady under fire, but something in him had shifted after Syria. He'd left the service abruptly, no goodbye, no explanation. Rumors said he'd tried his hand at contracting work overseas, then real estate back home. He carried himself like a man who was always one step ahead of his own mistakes. As they walked through the hallway, Eli glanced up at the peeling frescoes, pretending to admire them. "Can't believe you actually bought this place," he said. $100 though, hell of a deal." "Yeah," Jack replied, watching him carefully. "You said the city wanted it gone." Eli nodded. "Too many stories, too many lawsuits. People say it's cursed, probably just old wiring and mold." He chuckled again, but Jack noticed his hand twitch once toward his jacket pocket before he caught himself. Ranger growled softly. Eli froze, then knelt to pat the dog, masking tension with a grin. "Still got that sixth sense, huh? Guess neither of you can relax." "We don't sleep well," Jack said flatly. Eli stayed only a few minutes longer, enough to glance around the house, ask perfunctory questions, and say, "Don't dig too deep into the past, Jack. Some things are better left sealed up." The phrase hung heavy in the air. After he left, the house seemed to grow darker, the light fading too fast for noon. Ranger padded to the staircase and sniffed toward the basement door. It was slightly ajar. Jack frowned. He was sure it had been shut. He crouched, running a hand through the layer of dust on the floor, and stopped. Clear as day, a single boot print stood there, deep and fresh. The tread was unmistakable. SEAL Combat Boot Mark 9, the kind only issued to their unit. Jack's pulse quickened. Eli had been here earlier, but this print was still damp, the dust clinging wetly around its edges. He aimed his phone flashlight at it, took a photo, and stayed crouched for a moment longer, his reflection trembling in the screen. Ranger pressed close beside him, ears flat, body tense. The dog's gaze fixed on the basement steps, tail stiff and unmoving. The silence that followed felt wrong, too complete. Jack pocketed the phone, stood and whispered, "It's just the past, that's all." But deep down, he knew better. The past didn't leave footprints. The past didn't open doors. The faint smell of metal and oil hung in the air now, a scent that belonged not to decay but to the armory of men who had once fought in shadows. Somewhere below, a loose beam creaked, and Ranger's low growl rolled through the hall. Jack stared into the darkness at the bottom of the stairs, the place where light refused to reach, and every instinct he had ever trusted whispered the same warning. He wasn't alone in the house. Not anymore. By mid-afternoon, the sea mist had crept back over Harbor Point, turning the Marino estate into a silhouette swallowed by fog. Jack had spent hours in the basement searching for answers that refused to come. His flashlight cutting through the gloom, the metallic smell of old concrete mixing with the ocean air that seeped through cracks in the foundation. The military box from yesterday sat on the work table, still open, its corroded bullets glinting faintly. Ranger lay nearby, head between his paws, eyes half closed but restless, like a sentry pretending to sleep. Jack leaned back, rubbing his scar, that faint line above his temple that throbbed whenever he tried to remember Syria. It wasn't the wound that hurt, it was the noise it carried, the scream, the blast, the last time he'd seen Anna alive. He was halfway up the stairs when the doorbell rang. The sound startled him, clear and sharp, something ordinary in a place that had forgotten what ordinary felt like. Ranger barked once, low and uncertain. When Jack opened the front door, a woman stood on the porch, holding a clipboard dampened by mist. She was in her mid-30s, tall and slender, with chestnut hair tied back loosely, and tired green eyes framed by wire glasses. Her jacket bore a patch that read, Massachusetts Environmental Authority. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady but quick, the way people sound when they've rehearsed bad news. "Mr. Bennett, I'm Sarah Lowell. I was hoping to speak with you about this property." Jack studied her warily. She looked like someone used to fieldwork, boots muddy, fingernails faintly stained with soil. A thin scar curved along her wrist, old, faded, maybe from handling lab equipment or something worse. "Environmental authority?" he asked. "You think this place is killing the grass?" She almost smiled. If only it were that simple. There's been a long-standing issue with this parcel of land. The Merino estate was flagged years ago for possible contamination, but the records vanished. We've been trying to locate anyone with ownership documents. You're the first to actually buy it. Jack crossed his arms. Eli Ward arranged it, said it was all cleared. At the mention of the name, Sarah's expression darkened just slightly. Eli Ward. I've seen that name before, in one of the missing reports. She stepped inside without waiting to be invited, scanning the room with a professional's eye. The damp air made her hair frizz slightly, and she tucked a loose strand behind her ear as she crouched near the baseboards. "You can smell it," she said. "That metallic tang, it's not just rust. Something's seeping from under the structure. Possibly solvent or..." She stopped when she noticed the open ammo box on the table. "Where did you get that?" Jack hesitated. "Inside the wall." Sarah's face drained of color. "That's not possible. These markings, Project Revenant, they were supposed to be sealed in 2012, classified military waste, mislabeled and buried off-grid." Her gaze met his. "You shouldn't even have touched it." Jack's chest tightened. "You said you'd seen Eli's name before. What does he have to do with this?" Sarah hesitated, eyes flickering as though deciding whether to trust him. "Years ago, a field contractor named Eli Ward signed off on the disposal logs for this region. But when the environmental inspectors arrived, the disposal site was gone, and so was the evidence. Someone paid a lot to make this place disappear." Ranger rose to his feet, moving between them, tail low, ears alert. The dog sniffed the air, then growled softly toward the hall leading back to the basement. Sarah turned. "Is there someone else here?" "No," Jack said, though he wasn't sure. They followed Ranger downstairs, the dog's movements cautious but confident. The beam of Jack's flashlight swept over damp stone, catching motes of dust that swirled like ash. The smell grew heavier, metal, oil, something acidic beneath it all. "There," Sarah whispered, pointing at a section of wall darker than the rest. The cement bulged slightly, as if something behind it was pushing outward. Jack scraped the surface with his knife. Fresh moisture bled through, streaking his hand gray. "Still wet," he muttered. "Could be groundwater," she said, "or pressure from below." But her voice betrayed uncertainty. In the far corner of the basement stood a cracked mirror, tall and arched, framed in rusted steel. It looked out of place, too clean for the rest of the room. Jack hadn't noticed it before. When he swung the light toward it, the reflection rippled slightly, as though the glass itself was breathing. For a moment, he saw himself, and someone behind him, a man in fatigues, face shadowed by the brim of a helmet moving soundlessly across the frame. Jack turned sharply. Nothing. Only Ranger, staring into the same mirror, teeth bared. "It's just the angle," Jack said under his breath, but the words felt like a lie. Sarah's phone buzzed. She glanced down. "My sensor's picking something up. Air particulates, trace ammonia compounds. Not enough to kill us, but high enough to suggest leakage." She looked back at Jack. "This house shouldn't be habitable. Whoever sold it to you either didn't know or didn't care." "He knew," Jack said quietly. "Trust me." He crouched beside the wall again, his hand tracing a faint outline in the dust, a boot print, partially smeared but still visible. The same tread pattern he'd photographed before. Seal issue. He felt his pulse climb. Sarah noticed his expression. "What is it?" "Nothing," he said. "Old marks." But Ranger's growl deepened, vibrating through the floorboards. The lights flickered once, twice. The basement seemed to pulse with a low hum, like a generator buried deep beneath the earth. Sarah grabbed his arm. "We need to get out of here." Jack nodded, pocketing the small badge he'd found earlier. As they climbed the stairs, he looked back one last time. In the mirror's reflection, faint and distant, stood Anna, her face pale, her eyes endless with grief. She didn't speak, didn't move. Then the light cut out completely, leaving only Ranger's bark echoing through the dark. Upstairs, the air felt thin, the fog pressing against the windows. Sarah gathered her gear, visibly shaken but forcing composure. "I'll file a report," she said. "But it might not make a difference. This whole area is under political lockdown. If someone powerful wants this buried, it'll stay buried." Jack followed her to the door. "Why tell me all this?" "Because," she said, tightening her jacket, "I think your wife tried to warn me once. A few months before Syria, she emailed me about a shipment of hazardous material linked to Harbor Point. Said if anything happened to her, the truth was here." She hesitated, eyes softening. I didn't believe her. Until now. The wind rose outside, carrying the cry of gulls and the far-off rumble of waves. Sarah stepped off the porch, her figure dissolving into fog. Jack stood there long after she disappeared, the house groaning softly behind him, the mirror still waiting in the basement below. Ranger pressed against his leg, quiet now, as if sensing the weight that had settled over his master. "You saw her too, didn't you?" Jack whispered. The dog only whined and lowered his head. Inside the house, somewhere deep within the walls, came a faint, rhythmic tapping. 3 slow beats, a pause, and then silence. The next evening brought with it a fragile peace. The rain had stopped, leaving the world wrapped in that eerie silence that follows a long storm. The Merino house gleamed faintly under the pale light of the moon, its windows fogged, its walls breathing out the moisture it had swallowed. Jack sat by the window with a single lamp on, the yellow glow illuminating the empty glass beside him. He hadn't slept since Sarah left. Her words still circled in his mind like waves breaking against the same shore. Project Revenant, Eli Ward, Anna's message. Everything pointed back to the same ghost. Ranger lay stretched at his feet, eyes half open, ears twitching with each distant creak. The dog had hardly left Jack's side since that night in the basement. At 8 p.m., the sound of tires crunching gravel pulled Jack from his thoughts. Through the curtains, he saw headlights sweep across the drive. A black pickup stopped outside, and from it stepped Eli Ward. He was dressed in a brown leather jacket and jeans that looked too new, too deliberate. His hair, once regulation short, had grown thick and unruly, streaked with gray. His face was handsome in a weary way, sharp jawline, eyes the color of rainwater, but there was something hollow in his expression, a restlessness that came from guilt worn too long. He carried a bottle of bourbon in one hand and that familiar smile that had once meant brotherhood. "Thought I'd bring a housewarming gift," Eli said when Jack opened the door. His tone was casual, but his eyes roamed the room, measuring it the way a man sizes up an old battlefield. "You always knew how to pick places that creak?" Jack stepped aside. "You never did like silence." Eli chuckled, setting the bottle down on the table. "Silence makes men think too much, and thinking, Jack, well, you were never good at that when it counted." The words might have been teasing once, but they landed heavier now. They sat across from each other in the kitchen, the air thick with the scent of damp wood and whiskey. Eli poured 2 glasses and slid one toward him. "To the dead," he said. Jack hesitated, then raised his glass. "To those who stayed." They drank. The bourbon burned going down. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Eli leaned back, studying him. "You ever wonder," he began slowly, "how things might have gone if someone else had been in that convoy, if maybe someone had kept her back?" His voice cracked just slightly on the last word. Jack's hand froze on the table. "Don't," he said quietly. "Not tonight." Eli laughed under his breath. "Still can't talk about it, huh? Still pretending you did everything right?" His eyes glistened, sharp and wet. "If I had been there, she'd still be alive. You know it." Jack looked down at his glass, the bourbon trembling slightly in his grip. The scar on his temple ached, the old guilt waking. "You weren't there, Eli. None of us were supposed to be there. We were ordered out." You disobeyed orders to go back for her, Eli snapped, standing now, voice rising. You wanted to be the hero, and you got her killed! Ranger barked once, loud and fierce, startling them both. The dog stood between them, muscles taut, teeth bared. The silence that followed was long. Eli exhaled slowly, forcing a smile as if trying to take the words back. Guess I had too much to drink, he muttered, picking up the bottle. His hand shook slightly as he poured another shot. Old ghosts, you know. Jack didn't reply. He could see in Eli's face the same thing he'd seen in Too Many Soldiers, the moment when grief curdles into hatred. But this hatred wasn't for the war, it was for him. Eli swallowed hard and forced a laugh. You always have something protecting you, don't you, Jack? First her, then the dog, maybe luck itself. Or maybe it's just your lies. His eyes burned with something colder than anger. Jack stood slowly. I think you should go. Eli looked around one last time, gaze lingering on the basement door. You ever feel like the past is breathing down there? He said softly. Maybe some things don't stay buried. He placed the empty glass on the counter, nodded once, and left without another word. When the sound of his truck faded into the distance, the house seemed to sigh. Jack leaned against the counter, his hands shaking slightly. Ranger still stood near the doorway, staring at the basement steps. Jack followed his gaze. The door hung slightly ajar. I know, Jack whispered. I locked it this morning. The two descended the steps together, the flashlight's beam slicing through the darkness. The air smelled faintly of mold and burnt paper. Near the furnace, a small pile of ashes lay scattered. Fresh. Jack crouched, sifting through them until he found the edge of a half-burned envelope. On it, faintly legible through the scorch marks, was his wife's handwriting. He brushed the ashes away carefully, revealing a fragment of a letter. If you're reading this, it means I've failed. They're still here. The words stopped there, the rest lost to fire. Jack's throat tightened. He recognized the paper, stationery Anna used for field notes. Ranger whimpered softly, pressing his nose against Jack's hand. He knows, Jack murmured. He's looking for it too. He searched the surrounding floor, noticing that the dust near the furnace was disturbed, footprints overlapping, one on top of another. The pattern matched the seal boot tread again, but deeper this time, as if whoever had stood there had lingered, pressing their weight into the earth. Jack aimed his flashlight toward the corner where the mirror stood. Its glass was clouded now, fogged from within. For a brief moment he saw movement, someone walking past behind him, but when he turned, the room was empty. Only the faint echo of his own breath filled the space. Upstairs, the wind had picked it up again, rattling the old windows. Jack climbed back into the kitchen, closing the basement door behind him. He poured another glass of bourbon, hands steady now, the fear replaced by something colder, resolve. Eli's words replayed in his head, each one cutting deeper. You got her killed. But Anna's letter said otherwise. Someone else had been involved, someone who was still here. Ranger rested his head on Jack's knee, eyes watchful. Jack whispered, We'll find it, boy, whatever she left behind, before he does. Outside, thunder rolled far out over the sea, though no storm had been forecast. The house groaned again, wood shifting, as if listening. Somewhere deep below, unseen, something moved, the faint scrape of metal against stone, like a door unlocking itself. Jack didn't notice. He only stared at the letter, the smudged ink spelling the beginning of a truth he wasn't yet ready to face. The air was heavy that morning, the kind that clung to the skin before a storm. A thin mist rolled across Harbor Point, swallowing the hills and the edge of the sea. Jack stood at the back of the Merino estate, shovel in hand, staring at the old drainage pit that connected to the basement. The ground was soft from recent rain, black soil oozing around his boots. Ranger prowled nearby, his fur bristling, tail straight like an antenna. The dog's nose kept pressing to the same spot on the foundation wall, nostrils flaring as if something beneath the surface breathed back at him. Jack's mind drifted to the half-burned letter upstairs, its final words seared into memory. They're still here. When Sarah arrived, she looked different from before. No longer the calm, methodical engineer, but someone restless, carrying a quiet fury under her composed exterior. Her jacket was replaced by a heavy work vest, and she carried a portable Geiger sensor and a crowbar. The gray light caught her features sharply. Tall frame, hair tied high, strands whipping in the breeze, her green eyes fierce behind protective goggles. "You didn't call me," she said, voice clipped. "I followed the readings. The contamination levels spiked overnight." Jack wiped his hands on his jeans. "I figured you'd show up anyway." "You figured right," she said, setting down her equipment. "Let's see what your house is hiding." Inside, the basement reeked of mildew and rust. The walls wept moisture. Ranger's paws left muddy prints across the concrete as he moved from corner to corner, whining, then barking twice at the far wall where the cement had buckled slightly. Sarah crouched, placing the sensor against the surface. The screen flashed red. "There's a heat signature behind this wall, metallic density, maybe a container," she murmured. Jack grabbed a pickaxe from the tool rack. "Then we dig." "Wait," she said, eyes narrowing. "You realize this could be military ordnance. You should report it." "And who's going to believe me?" he replied. "The same people who buried it here?" He swung the pickaxe once, twice. The cement cracked like bone. Dust filled the air, coating everything in a fine white film. Sarah coughed, covering her mouth with a scarf. Behind the first layer of concrete was a lattice of rusted rebar, then a hollow sound, metal against metal. They cleared it enough to reveal a steel drum, its surface slick with condensation. A faded logo marked its side, a trident surrounded by laurel leaves, the seal insignia. Beneath it, faint stenciling read, U.S. Naval Research Division. Sarah stepped closer, flashlight trembling in her hand. This is impossible. These were supposed to be decommissioned." Jack wiped the grime away, revealing a series of numbers he recognized instantly, the same operation code from Syria. "It's not impossible," he said quietly. "It's personal." Ranger's bark shattered the shit. Stillness. He turned toward the stairs, ears pricked, growl low and dangerous. The dog backed up, fur standing on end. Jack's instincts flared. He turned just as a shadow moved at the top of the steps. "You've really outdone yourself, Jack," came a voice he knew too well. Eli Ward. The man descended slowly, each footstep deliberate. His leather jacket was wet from the mist, hair slicked back, eyes bright and cold. In his right hand gleamed a pistol, its muzzle dark and steady. "You couldn't just let the past stay buried, could you?" he said, stepping into the lamplight. "You had to dig, always digging." Jack froze, muscles coiling. "You knew about this," he said. "You signed the disposal logs." Eli smirked. "Someone had to. Anna trusted me to handle things when you couldn't. You were too busy playing hero." His words were calm, almost rehearsed. "She didn't die because of me," Jack said, voice low. "You weren't there." Eli's smile faltered. "No, but I should have been. She chose you, and she paid the price." He raised the gun. "You took her, you took the mission, and now you want to take the truth too? No, this ends here." The shot came before Jack could move. A deafening crack filled the room. Sarah screamed and stumbled backward, clutching her shoulder, blood blooming through her vest. Ranger lunged with a snarl, knocking Eli off balance. The gun clattered across the floor. Jack rushed forward, grabbing Sarah as she fell. "Stay with me," he said, pressing a hand to her wound. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned. "Get out!" she gasped. "The drums, they're leaking." Jack turned. The bullet had grazed one of the barrels. A hiss filled the air, sharp and acrid, as a thin vapor began to seep through the hole. Eli scrambled up, clutching his arm where Ranger had bitten deep. Blood ran down his sleeve. "You don't understand what's in those," he shouted, his voice breaking. "They weren't supposed to open." He stumbled toward the stairs, leaving streaks of red on the wall. Jack half-carried, half-dragged Sarah toward the door. The air burned in his lungs. His eyes watered. The metallic scent thickened. Ranger barked frantically, darting back toward the leaking drums, teeth snapping at the vapor as if it were a living thing. "Ranger, come!" Jack shouted. The dog hesitated only a second before following, coughing and whining. They reached the surface, collapsing near the back steps. Sarah gasped for breath, pressing her hand to the wound. Jack tore his shirt into strips, tying it tightly around her shoulder. "You're going to be okay," he said, though he wasn't sure she could hear. "You're stubborn enough to survive anything." She laughed weakly. "You don't know me that well." "I'm starting to," he replied. Her hand found his wrist, holding tight. "Don't let him destroy it," she whispered. "The proof. Anna died for it." Her grip loosened, eyes fluttering as she fainted. Jack looked back at the house. Through the basement windows, a dim yellow glow pulsed, followed by a low, guttural sound. The drums expanding, metal groaning under pressure. The Marino estate seemed to breathe again, the way a wounded animal gasps before dying. "Easy," Jack murmured to Ranger. "We'll go back, but not now." The dog licked his hand, whining softly. Far off, sirens echoed faintly, though Jack knew they would come too late. The poison was already awake. He pulled Sarah into his truck, laid her across the back seat, and turned the ignition. As the headlights cut through the mist, he caught one last glimpse of Eli through the cracked windshield, standing near the tree line, one arm bleeding, the gun still in his other hand. Their eyes met across the distance. Eli mouthed something Jack couldn't hear, but he read the shape of it easily. "She chose you." Then he vanished into the fog. Jack gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. "We're not done," he muttered, voice trembling with anger. "Not by a long shot." Jack returned to the Marino estate before dawn, the sky a blunt gray like old metal. He had left Sarah in the care of the hospital. She'd been stabilized, they had said, but her voice on the ride over had been thin and certain. "Don't let them bury it." Ranger rode in the back of the pickup with his head over the tailgate, muzzle white where the older dog had been nicked by barbs of winter and war. The German shepherd moved with the sure-footedness of a working partner, every muscle tuned to scent and shadow. Jack's hands were steady on the wheel, but his jaw felt raw from sleepless grinding. He'd promised Sarah he'd see this through. The promise sat in his chest like a weight that didn't want to be shifted. The basement door was ajar when he pushed it open, humid air spilling out like breath. The beams of his flashlight cut through dust motes and a faint chemical tang, an acid edge beneath the earthy smell of wet concrete. Ranger nosed ahead, then doubled back, tail low and alert, the way trained dogs signal, danger first, then assessment. Jack swung the light around the ruined storage room, past the collapsed shelves and the half-burned letters he'd tried to piece together earlier. Near the far wall, half hidden beneath a rusted grate, he spotted a metal trunk wedged into a cavity, the kind of archive Chesterfield teams used to secure documents. He pried it free with a crowbar until the rust gave and the lid sighed open. Inside lay folders bound in oilcloth, stamped on the outside with a stencil he had come to hate, Project Revenant, Confidential. His fingers trembled as he pulled the first sheet free. The dossier smelled of old paper and machine oil. Photographs slipped from between the pages, grainy stills from surveillance cams and a creased Polaroid that had been carefully preserved. The Polaroid caught a scene Jack had never expected to see. Anna leaning against a concrete blast barrier, hair plastered from sweat, eyes hard with decision. And beside her, Eli, face cast in the yellow haze of a generator light, pressing something small into his gloved palm. Jack's throat closed. Another image, a black and white still from a surveillance array, showed Eli kneeling at a control box, one hand braced on the metal, the other pressing a thumb into a detonator that glinted like a promise. The timestamp was cruel, minutes before the explosion that had taken Anna. The photographs were meticulous, intimate. Someone had been documenting the whole event, someone who wanted the truth to survive. Ranger growled low, the sound a rumbling caution. Jack absorbed the images in a slow, cold wash. He had replayed every decision, every angle of that last mission in his head for years, torturing himself with what-ifs and if-onlys. This was a different kind of cut, evidence that the accident had not been an accident. The files included notes, handwritten entries with Anna's looping script describing meetings, names, shipments. Anna had been collecting proof. She had documented the illegal stowage of chemical agents labeled with naval insignia and had traced a paper trail leading back to a small circle of contractors, politicians, and a name he now saw scrawled in the margins over and over, Eli Ward. His hands went cold. Footsteps above the basement scraped like a cautious predator. Jack set the photos carefully back in the oilcloth and jammed the lid shut with his shoulder. Ranger planted himself at the bottom of the stairs, hackles raised. The motion on the stairwell was familiar. Too familiar. Eli stepped into the dim, his jacket torn and stained, his left forearm a ragged red where Ranger had bitten earlier. Rain clung to his hair. His eyes were rimmed with fatigue and something like resolve. Where anger had been aglow before, grief hardened his face into something brittle. He looked older than the last time Jack had seen him in uniform, not because years had passed, but because he had been eroded by choices. "So you found the chest," Eli said without preamble, voice rough. "I was afraid you might." Jack didn't reply. The old radio operator had always been precise with words, a man who kept records and radio logs like others collected coins. Now the habit of documentation lay open in Jack's hands. Eli took a breath that trembled and then leaned against a column, the pistol he'd been dragging earlier now an idle weight at his hip. "You think it proves anything?" he asked. The words were small. Jack forced himself to speak, each syllable measured. "It proves you were there. It proves you pressed the trigger." Eli's face flickered with something like shame. Then he laughed once, a brittle, ugly sound. "I pressed the trigger because the world had its foot on her throat, Jack. Because the men who would take her alive would have stripped whatever was left of her and used it as leverage forever. I gave her back the only thing they couldn't take." His voice broke on the last line. The confession landed between them, heavy with logic and lunacy. Jack felt the old tidal grief rising, a surge that had once dragged him through the surf of war. "You killed her," he said. The words fell like stones into a pool. Eli's eyes fixed on Jack with an intensity that stunned. "I set the charges because she asked me to," he said. "She wanted this hidden stopped. She knew the risk. She asked me, Jack." Ranger pawed the concrete, whining. The accusation in the air was complicated now, intention braided with guilt, and disturbingly, an idea of mercy twisted into violence. Jack's fist clenched. "You played God," he said. "You made a verdict." Eli's pride cracked into something like apology. "I thought if this thing was gone, if those drums were destroyed, maybe the names would die with it. Maybe the town could breathe. Maybe she could be remembered instead of used." He swallowed. "I wanted to make sure she wasn't used." Rage lit in Jack, a hard, bright flare. Before he could move, Eli stumbled, his wound opening where Ranger had bitten him, and the smell of smoke punched the air. The metal drums near the wall, jostled earlier by the struggles and the impact of the crowbar, now hissed as a small spark kissed an exposed seam. A chemical mist coiled upward, thin and white, and then a hiss of ignition sparked a tongue of flame along the oilcloth. Jack's training returned in a flood. Assess, act, contain. He hit the alarm with his elbow. The house's century-old fire system squealed to life, pumps kicking water into the sprinkler heads. A wet roar filled the basement as steam and water hammered the leaking drums, clouding the room in white vapor. Ranger barked, gripped at Eli's sleeve and snarled, teeth showing. Eli staggered, cursing, trying to pull himself toward the stairwell, but the flames licked faster, fed by trapped gases and oily residue. He coughed, eyes rolling with smoke. "I didn't mean," he managed, before a falling beam trapped his foot and the fire climbed like a living thing. "She was supposed to be mine," he whispered, a child's broken thing, not the man he'd pretended to be. Jack moved then, harnessing the old muscle memory that had kept men alive overseas, kicking debris, grunting as he levered a beam free. Ranger twisted and pulled at Eli's sleeve, teeth clamped into fabric to haul him toward the stairs. Jack shoved, sweat and smoke stinging his eyes. For a terrifying second it looked as if the house would keep its secret, the flames swallowing the proof and the confessions both. Then, with a last heave, Eli's foot broke free and he tumbled into Jack's arms, coughing, eyes wide. The stairwell behind them moaned and the ceiling groaned. The sprinkler's rhythm turned to metal screams. Jack hauled Eli up, boots slipping on wet concrete, teeth clenched against the smoke. They burst into the open night, spit and water and the sulfur tinge of burned plastic. Eli collapsed in the grass, coughing, a hand pressed to his chest. Ember fragments rained from the roof as the Merino house protested its wounds. Ranger lay nearby, chest heaving, tongue lolling, eyes bright and fierce. Jack stood over Eli, and for a beat he saw the man he'd once trusted, the radio operator who had answered with cool competence under mortar fire. than the man who'd fallen in love with Anna and become something else. "Why?" Jack asked, voice raw. Eli's reply was a whisper that the wind tried to steal. So she would mean something. The sirens were closer now, and in the hollow where the house had been, something else had been exposed. A truth that would not go quietly. Jack tucked the damp oilcloth dossier under his arm. He had the proof, and with it the ruin of a friendship and the fragile thread of the justice he'd promised Sarah. Ranger pressed against his leg as if to demand they not let the moment slip. Jack looked down at the dog, then at the smoking windows, and felt a clarity he hadn't earned. Burning down lies will not bring the dead back, but it might finally allow the living to breathe. The hospital smelled of salt and antiseptic. Beyond the window, dawn stretched pale and colorless, the horizon still bruised with the night smoke. Jack Bennett woke to the rhythmic beeping of monitors and the sterile hum of fluorescent lights. His body felt like stone, ribs bound tight, throat dry, mind thick with memory. The last thing he remembered was the roar of the fire, the collapsing beams, Ranger's growl echoing through smoke, and Eli's broken whisper, "She was supposed to be mine." He blinked until the ceiling stopped swimming. A soft shuffle of shoes pulled his focus to the doorway. Detective Harlan Bishop stepped inside. He was a man carved by years of police work, broad shoulders, thick neck, gray stubble shading a square jaw. His navy suit hung slightly loose, as though he'd lost more sleep than weight. The detective's expression carried both fatigue and curiosity, the kind men wear when they've seen too much and are waiting for something to surprise them again. "Mr. Bennett," he said, flipping open a notepad. "You've had quite a night." Jack managed a dry smile. That's one way to put it. Bishop sat down beside the bed. "We got statements from the fire crew. The estate's mostly gone, chemical residue everywhere, but we managed to pull some sealed documents before the roof caved in, enough to keep a few politicians awake tonight." He leaned forward, tone softening. "Sarah Lowell's stable. Bullet missed the lung. She's lucky you got her out when you did." Jack exhaled, tension leaving his chest by degrees. "She's tough," he said. "She's not built to quit." Bishop nodded. "Neither are you, it seems. The state's already moving. The mayor, Reed, was taken into custody an hour ago. Turns out your friend Eli Ward made deposits under Reed's development firm for years. Slush funds, cover-ups, false contracts tied to that Project Revenant mess. It's all unraveling now." Jack stared at his bandaged hands. "What about Eli?" Bishop hesitated. "We found him outside the house. Burns, broken ribs, but alive. He's under guard until he can be questioned. Said you pulled him out of the fire." His gaze sharpened. "Why'd you do that?" Jack looked past the detective toward the window, where the sea glimmered faintly under the rising sun. "Because I couldn't save her," he said quietly. "And because once, he was my brother." Bishop studied him for a moment, then stood. "We'll need a full statement later. Get some rest, Mr. Bennett. You've done more than enough." He left, and the door clicked softly shut behind him. Ranger stirred from his spot at the foot of the bed, tail thumping weakly. The German shepherd looked older than Jack remembered, muzzle silvered, one ear drooping from scar tissue. He raised his head and rested it on Jack's leg. Jack smiled faintly, running his fingers through the coarse fur. "Good boy," he murmured. "You never give up, do you?" The dog licked his hand once, a quiet affirmation. For the first time in years, Jack let himself rest without reaching for a weapon or a reason to keep moving. Sleep came in shallow waves, filled with fragments of Anna's laughter and the ocean's hiss. By afternoon, he was discharged under supervision. The nurses gave him a paper bag of medication and the kind of sympathetic glances reserved for veterans who carried more than visible wounds. Outside, the air smelled clean again, like wet asphalt and sea spray. Ranger trotted beside him on a makeshift leash, tail brushing his thigh. Sarah was being transferred to a rehabilitation wing nearby. Before leaving, she'd sent a note folded into his discharge papers. "You kept your promise. Don't stop now." The handwriting was careful but shaky. Jack tucked it into his pocket and walked toward the cliff road overlooking the water. The ocean was restless, gray waves breaking white against the rocks below. Jack stopped near the edge where gulls wheeled overhead and the wind pulled at his shirt. He reached into his jacket and drew out his wedding ring, the gold dulled from years of sweat and time. The weight of it was small but solid, the last remnant of a life that had burned away. "I found the truth," he said softly, voice barely louder than the surf. "But it doesn't bring you back. I'm sorry, Anna. I should have listened sooner." Ranger sat beside him, staring out at the same horizon. Jack turned the ring in his fingers once, then let it fall. It caught a ray of sunlight before vanishing into the foam below. For a long time he stood there, watching the tide take it, until the ache in his chest began to ease. Ranger pressed his head against Jack's thigh. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of salt and ash away from shore. He imagined, for just a moment, that Anna was standing behind him, her hand on his shoulder, her smile gentle, the same smile she'd worn the first time she'd said goodbye. He didn't turn. Some ghosts, he thought, are meant to stay where they are. The sound of distant sirens carried up the cliffs, news crews maybe, or cleanup teams coming to seal the remains of the estate. But their noise felt far away now. Jack crouched, scratched Ranger behind the ear and whispered, "Let's go home." The dog wagged his tail once and rose, his gait still strong despite the limp in his back leg. Together, they followed the narrow path along the cliffs where the sunlight began to break through the clouds. Behind them, the waves swallowed what was left of the house's debris, and the air smelled of sea wind, not smoke. For the first time since the war, Jack felt the weight of the past lift just enough for him to breathe. The morning sun crept slowly over the coast, casting gold across the sea and the rebuilt grounds of what had once been the Merino estate. Where charred ruins had stood, there now rose a graceful modern structure of glass and timber, light spilling from its wide windows like warmth returning to an old scar. The sign near the entrance gleamed softly. Anna and Sarah Memorial Center for Veterans and Rescue Dogs. The air smelled of pine and sea salt, and somewhere in the distance, gulls cried over the waves. Jack Bennett stood by the flagpole, watching the staff prepare for the opening ceremony. His once dark hair had turned almost silver at the temples, and the lines around his eyes had deepened, though there was a steadiness to him now that had not existed before. He wore a simple navy shirt rolled at the sleeves, his stance relaxed yet firm, the posture of a man who had fought too many battles but finally learned how to set his weapon down. Beside him, Ranger walked with a slow, dignified gait. The German shepherd was old now, his muzzle white, movements deliberate. Yet his eyes, sharp amber, loyal and unbroken, still followed Jack everywhere. The bond between them was quieter now, not the fevered companionship of survival, but something gentler, rooted in shared healing. Sarah Lowell emerged from the center, sunlight glancing off her auburn hair. She was stronger than she had been that night in the fire, the scar on her shoulder faint beneath the pale blue fabric of her blouse. She had returned to full strength with the same determination that had carried her through the investigation, methodical, grounded, unafraid of pain. "They're waiting for you," she said, smiling. "You're the guest of honor, remember?" Jack chuckled. "I thought you were running the show." "I manage," she said. "You inspire." As they walked together toward the courtyard, the breeze lifted the flag, the stars and stripes fluttering beside another smaller banner bearing the words, "From ashes, we heal." Beneath the banners, rows of folding chairs faced a small stage draped in white cloth. Veterans sat in clusters, their service dogs at their feet. Labradors, shepherds, retrievers, and mutts alike. Some in vests marked therapy and training. The air was alive with the quiet murmur of people reconnecting. Laughter, the soft bark of dogs, the metallic chime of tags. It was not a ceremony of mourning, but of rebuilding. On stage, Sarah began the introduction. Her voice carried confidence and warmth, the kind that drew even restless dogs to listen. She spoke of community, of purpose, rediscovered through service and compassion. "This center," she said, "was born from loss, but it stands for hope. Here, our veterans and our rescue dogs heal side by side. Every brick of this place carries the story of survival." When she turned to Jack and gestured for him to come forward, the audience applauded softly. Jack stepped up, clearing his throat. He had never liked speeches. Words were harder than combat. Yet when he looked out over the crowd, men and women who bore the same invisible wounds he carried, the words came easily. "A year ago," he began, "I stood on this land surrounded by fire and ghosts. I thought what we'd lost couldn't be rebuilt. But it turns out, sometimes what's destroyed leaves room for something truer to rise." He paused, eyes finding Ranger at the edge of the platform. "This place isn't about war. It's about what comes after. About the fight to live again, to trust again. And none of us win that fight alone." He glanced at Sarah, whose eyes glistened with quiet pride. "Anna once told me," he continued, "that truth is a kind of light. You can bury it, hide it, even burn it, but it finds its way back through the cracks. Today, I think she'd be proud to see that light shining here." He nodded toward the crowd. "To everyone who helped build this, thank you. And to those still fighting their own battles, you're not forgotten." When he stepped back, applause broke through, mingled with whistles and barks. Ranger barked once, low and strong, tail thumping, as if he understood every word. Jack smiled and crouched to scratch behind his ears. "That's your cue, old boy," he murmured. "We've got work to do." Later, as dusk fell, the courtyard emptied slowly. The ocean breeze carried laughter and the scent of grilled food from the volunteers' tent. Jack and Sarah lingered near the flagpole, the sky deepening into violet. Lanterns flickered to life along the walkways, their light reflected in the glass walls of the center. Inside, a few veterans worked with their dogs, practicing obedience, laughter echoing through the training hall. Sarah leaned against the railing, arms folded loosely. "You did good today," she said softly. Jack smiled. "We did good." His gaze drifted toward the memorial garden near the building's edge, where two small plaques stood side by side, one for Anna, one for the fallen rescue dogs of Project Revenant. "She'd like this place," he said. "The open space, the sea air." "I think she's here," Sarah replied, "in every story that ends better than it began." Jack nodded, his voice barely above the wind. "Yeah, I think she's smiling." Ranger settled between them, eyes half closed, listening to the rhythm of their voices and the distant crash of waves. The wind picked up, cool and clean, rustling through the flags above. The building's windows glowed gold in the twilight, like the house itself breathed light. A group of young veterans passed by with their dogs, laughing, the sound rolling across the courtyard like a new heartbeat. Sarah looked at Jack, her expression soft. "You know," she said, "you could finally let yourself be happy." Jack met her eyes and smiled faintly. "Maybe I already am." They stood together in silence, watching as the last light faded from the horizon, the flag snapped gently in the wind. From above, the new center glowed against the dark coastline, its lights stretching across the water like lanterns guiding lost sailors home. On the front wall, a plaque caught the last glimmer of sunset. "From ashes we heal." Sometimes God doesn't send angels with wings. He sends a loyal dog, a memory that refuses to fade, or a stranger who reminds us we're not alone. Maybe miracles aren't found in the sky, but in the quiet moments when love returns, when pain gives way to peace, and when we choose to believe again. If this story touched your soul, share it with someone who still needs hope. Tell us where you're watching from, leave a prayer in the comments, and subscribe for more stories of faith, loyalty, and redemption. May God bless you, and may His light guide you through every dark night toward the dawn of healing.